Thank you very much. It is really an honor to be here today. These are very, very important times. This year there are going to be major important decisions that are going to guide the development agenda until 2030. So it is time to be ambitious and to think, how is the world, how we want it in 2030? So on social protection, let me start by emphasizing that social protection is a human right. It appears in Articles 22 and 25, the Human Rights Declaration, in a number of ILO conventions, and lately in Recommendation 202 on social protection floors. And despite all these efforts for decades, still only 27% of the world has adequate access to social protection. Now, in recent years, it has been a lot of investment on social protection. This has been a really fast-tracked agenda, which is important to notice. And why is that? It is because it has demonstrable results. It has very, very strong human development impacts. To start with, social protection cash transfer can reduce poverty overnight. Just by the fact of one person receiving a cash transfer stops being poor if the level is adequate. We know it has impacts, of course, on inequality and reduces hunger and malnutrition. We know that in children, even a small cash transfer has a great impact on their attendance to school, on their health levels. We know for all these reasons it increases productivity and it supports populations that cannot work, like persons with disabilities, like those who are sick, or like the unemployed that need also support. But more importantly than that is the argument that, that it has emerged since the crisis, and is that social protection also contributes to economic growth. And how is that? Let me put an example. It's the case of China. Now, China saw that after the crisis, the demand for Chinese products was decreasing. And then it realized that a major avenue for growth, it was actually to develop its internal market. And for that, it has started supporting social protection big way. The expansion of social protection in China is really remarkable. It has achieved nearly universal pension coverage in only a few years. And it has plans to keep improving it in terms of benefit adequacy and full coverage by 2020. So that example has been learned by many other developing countries that at the moment are considering social protection not just because of the human impacts, but also because they support to economic growth. By raising the income levels of citizens, you increase domestic demand. And then last but not least, actually, social protection has very positive impacts to reduce political instability. Now, we all know political stability is a critical issue in our times and not one, that is there. So investing in social protection has positive impacts on that too. Now, it is time really to be ambitious. And why I'm meaning that? This slide, where you can see here is the distribution of world income. On the top you have what the richest 20% has, and at the bottom what the poorest 20% has. And there are a number of ways to estimate that. This is the most conservative, but by no means in all the ways, at least the top 20% holds between 60 and 70% of all the wealth of the world. And the bottom one, very little. Now, clearly we have to put efforts to, to eradicate extreme poverty. Extreme poverty will be the bottom 20%. But I'm putting an emphasis here because these will be insufficient for a fair world. And what happens is the middle quintiles, which are the so-called middle classes in developing countries, they're actually very, very low income. And they are very vulnerable, to shocks and others. So therefore, this is a main argument why it's necessary to have universal social protection. This is systems of social protection that will protect all citizens, not just the poor. This is at the moment how we have social protection in the Sustainable Development Goals, and we have them very importantly. And Goal 1, to end poverty. and it refers to social protection systems and measures for all. This is a reference to universality, including social protection floors. We have it in Goal 5, which is gender, and we have it in Goal 10, which is inequality, rightly so. So now is the time of universal social protection. And why that? If you look at it, in the 2000s, we started getting universalism back into the development agenda. The Millennium Development Goals had universal education, primary education. Recently, the World Bank and WHO have done a major initiative on universal health, and is part of the Sustainable Development Goals. So, likewise, it's necessary to talk about universal social protection. And it fits with the idea of leaving nobody behind, which is behind all the logic of the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, how do you achieve universal social protection? There are many ways, and clearly every country can do it their own way. But normally, how the majority of world countries achieve it is by mixing contributory systems and non-contributory cash transfers. And the mix of both, the contributory and the non-contributory, is what gives you the universal for all. Here, at the bottom, we have the social protection floors that are reflected in Recommendation 202 of ILO. And that, what it does is talking about the importance of social protection across the life cycle, from income protection for children, during working age, that means a time of maternity, of unemployment, of illness, or when you have disabilities, and about universal old age pensions. Now, regarding the cash transfers, in recent years, there has been an explosion, really an explosion of cash transfers in developing countries. And we have lots of examples, from child and family benefits to cash transfers with a focus on human development, household minimum income support, public employment programs, maternity protection, social pensions, and unemployment protection. We have examples of all of them emerging in developing countries, which is great, great development. But what is less known is that a significant number of countries have achieved or nearly achieved universal social protection if you combine the two systems, the contributory and the non-contributory. So you do have more than 25 developing countries that have achieved nearly achieved universal social protection coverage, and you have them all there. Further, there is another number of countries that are at the moment piloting it in Africa. You have universal child benefits in another number of countries. So this expansion also shows, that this is the positive way to go in the future. So we think of 2030. How will we think how to move forward? And the Sustainable Development Goals about monitoring development. So here are 6 indicators that will change people's lives by 2030. Think a world in 2030 in which all older persons will receive a pension. All pregnant women who received a maternity support. All persons with severe disabilities will receive benefits. All workers will be covered by unemployment injury schemes. There will be support for the poor and the unemployed, and benefits will be expanded to families with children. That is doable, and that's the world we could think by 2030. The specific indicators, we can present them here quickly. They are in the presentation if somebody is more curious. They are ultimately in the World Social Protection Report. And the World Social Protection Report is done by ILO and is based on the Social Security Inquiry. This is an inquiry that is sent to governments, and it has been collected for decades. So all this administrative type of data is very well recorded in historical data sets that are available to monitor the Sustainable Development Goals. It could be complemented with household data surveys. Let me put an example, and I will not go into details, but let's think of all older persons receiving a pension by 2030. The specific indicators will be the share of persons above retirement age that received an old age pension. This is an ILO monitored indicator, and we have data for 175 countries. And currently, for those interested, 51% of all the persons in the world receive a pension. So it means 50% are already receiving a pension, which is good. And further, but this is the good news, in middle-income countries, the rate is about 44%, but there are very quick increases coming there because many middle-income developing countries are expanding. So it's a very feasible thing to monitor and will give us, good results, hopefully, by 2030. And this, we could go all the other indicators from, at working age, for persons with disabilities, for mothers during a time of pregnancy, and for families receiving child benefits. As mentioned, they are all ILO monitor indicators, and is doable. So going back to universal social protection, is it affordable? And this is one of the main resistances you always find. People say this is lovely, but is it? Actually, it is much cheaper than we think. And the calculations we have done on ILO, and this is put in an example, how much will it cost universal pensions in a long sample of 90 developing countries? Well, the cost of universal pensions, if it was a flat benefit to the whole population, which is not what we were referring, it will be between, well, about 7% of GDP to 2% of aggregated GDP. However, if we discount the contributory pensions, the mandatory contributory social insurance, and then you get that out, the numbers go down significantly. It goes only from 0.5% of GDP to 1.7 or so. Of course, the low-income countries, as you can see, have less amount of people contributing to social security, and you have much larger numbers in upper middle income and lower middle income. But, this is how development happens, progressively expanding social security coverage as well as cash transfers. This is for those interested, this will be the cost of the total cost of the social protection floor, including schemes for children in yellow, for orphans in red, for older persons in violet, in green for the unemployed and poor, in blue for persons with disabilities, and in pink maternity. These are all universal schemes. And the cost will go between 1.5% of GDP and some 7.5% of GDP of lower income countries. Low and lower middle income countries. So that is if assuming there was no contributory schemes. So just to give an example. And the reality is it is affordable because fiscal space exists in virtually all countries on the world. There are many options. They're all supported by the United Nations and by the international financial institutions, and these include from reallocating public expenditures to increasing tax revenues, and this is a major discussion nowadays in the context of financing for development. Another, because of increasing coverage of social security, because of fighting illicit financial flows, a very important point, and many other options that we have, and there's more arguments presented in ILO publications, including fiscal reserves and others. What is important is to see that each country has the option to use these resources for social development and social protection, that each country will do it at its own pace, depending on national dialogue and the agreement between all stakeholders, and it will move ahead in different manners. But this also shows one thing, and this is, I'm finishing here. In the Financing for Development conference, they're trying to look areas that will need support, critical support, to move the 2030 development agenda. And one of them is social protection. We do need some type of financing mechanism for social protection. Now, there have been a number of calls for a global fund for social protection and different proposals. This is good. The name is not really important here, because I think nobody really is suggesting a vertical fund. But at a minimum, what is very, very important is we fund the startup cost that it will that it will cost to assist developing countries to do all the design of the schemes, all the, getting information of beneficiaries, all the computer and the IT needed, all the training of national staff to make social protection a reality. These startup costs and technical assistance are not extremely expensive, but now it is really the time to put it ahead. Because if we put it and this gets promoted in the Financing for Development conference, chances are that countries are really going to expand social protection. These could be complemented in a selected number of countries on the cost on financing the cash transfers themselves. This is the recurring cost, the administrative and the cash transfers. This will depend how the Financing for Development discussions go. But it appears to be an appetite to finance some of the lower income or the least developed countries some of this cost. And last but not least, there is another very important proposal that we can think now in the context of the Financing for Development, and it's about the relationship between procurement and labor legislation. And here is now procurement, national procurement, when it's done, is just done, for the best cost. We could ensure that actually the, national labor legislation and social security contributions for workers that are under national bidding processes, they are done in accordance, they are included in the bidding documents. And that way it will be an exemplary practice. Anything that is done through public procurement, it will include respect for national legislation on labor and contributions to labor standards, which is a fantastic way to get the decent work agenda moving through procurement. Well, thank you very much for your time. You have more information at the World Social Protection Report, and we are at your service for any other doubt or question you may have. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed. And please do come and join me. Isabel? Katie, perhaps I could ask you first. I mean, every speaker so far has underlined the importance of this issue. Why, for you, is it so important that we integrate, it's on, they're on, you just speak, that we integrate social protection into the agenda? Why is it so crucial? And do you believe, I was very struck, you said this issue is being fast-tracked, but we also know there is a challenge in some countries with reductions in public spending and so on. Do you believe that the momentum is there? Katie first.
Thank you, Jackie. I think the momentum is absolutely there. It's been great to hear the arguments as to why social protection is so important. It's a human right, and we also know that it has had many positive impacts and can achieve a lot. I think it's crucial at this time, exactly because you say there's a tension in the rhetoric, I think, in developed and developing countries around austerity on the one hand, but trying to scale up social protection on the other hand. So it's great also to hear the Minister this morning say that it's a universal agenda and it cuts across developing and developed countries.
That's a very striking point, because I think I was reading, we in Europe tend to think austerity is a European phenomenon only, but of the 122 countries that are cutting budgets, many of them are developing countries. And that point, and I'll come back, and Rudy perhaps, oh no, I think it was Ambassador Frankine, galvanizing the public as well as governments. How important is it for you that we include social protection, and how do we galvanize both governments and public opinion? There's a mic. There we are.
Thank you for this question. It is indeed important to ensure that social protection and decent work are part of the post-2015 framework, and the EU has a very outspoken, explicit position on this, and it is repeatedly underlined by the EU negotiators all over the world. Social protection and decent work are the best instruments to combat poverty and also to empower people and to have more inclusive societies. And therefore, in order to increase the presence of social protection and decent work in the policies of countries, be it in the EU and elsewhere, it is important to mobilize the public sector, but also all relevant stakeholders. And so we are quite pleased that with this initiative like today, but also the initiative of Belgium on the Group of Friends for Decent Work and Social Protection in post-2015, this has helped a lot to get higher attention for social protection and decent work in post-2015 because it was not self-evident. 1 or 2 years ago, nobody would expect that decent work would have a target, a goal, and that social protection would be covered in different targets. This is really a success, and now we have to move also on the implementation side.
We'll come back on that, but Magdalena, as you say there, a couple of years ago nobody thought it would even be a target. There is a disappointment for many that it isn't a goal in itself, but do you think, are you encouraged by where we are now? And why for you? I think you were the former UN Special Rapporteur on Extreme Poverty and Human Rights. Why for you is it so important that this issue, having climbed up the agenda, stays there, if you like?
Well, it is critical. I think that it provides us with very practical tools to move from the rhetoric of human rights to the practical implementation. If we think, for example, that since 1966, states, and now more than 160 states, have committed to protect economic, social, and cultural rights, that the Millennium Declaration has a very strong emphasis on the protection of human rights. Well, now, through social protection system, we have the potential states have the potential to realize economic, social, and cultural rights of their population through well-established and human rights-based social protection systems.
Can I just when we talk about a human rights-based approach to this issue, what do we mean in practice? What difference does it make?
It has a lot of practical implications. I will refer only to three very concrete. The most important one, and I think that the point that we have to emphasize, is that human rights deals with asymmetries of power. It is a way to regulate and control authorities and power. Therefore, it really provides us with a tool to look at, or a lens to look at whether or not the policies in place are really tackling the obstacles that keep people living in poverty. Therefore, if we move on the practical implication of this, for example, one, it will be that it makes it essential to have accountability mechanism. So we have to hold responsible those who are implementing the policies. So again, this is critical to move from rhetoric to practice. Okay, we make all these important commitments regard to social protections and the SDGs and the MDGs, etc. Well, let's help the state and government accountable whether or not they're implementing. And this required this rights-based approach. It also requires a lens to hold accountable not only national states, but also the international assistance. Through a global partnership for development required something that is very critical, and the critical point is coherency in policies. Yeah. Therefore, developed state, for example, has to ensure that their bilateral and multilateral trade policies, environmental policies, and fiscal policies are also in line with the compliance with the SDGs. So again, this is our very few practical example of how a rights-based approach put on the table critical issues of accountability and regulating powers. And more important, that not only in symbolic terms, but it moved the whole discussion of social protection, and in particular from the component of non-contributory social protection system, from charity to entitlements, from beneficiaries to right holders.
Thank you very much. A comment on that, if you would, but also, if I can add, because we want to cover a lot of issues in this session, the crucial question that Tom asked us at the beginning about how you link this. We've heard about the multidimensional role of social protection. How do you link it to the other goals? How do you actively make that link work? What does it mean when we talk about integrating it into the agenda? How do you do that in practice? It's an easy word to use, and certainly in EU policy areas, often difficult to integrate multidimensional issues. How do you see the challenge? Who would like to come in? Rudy, perhaps a thought on that. So, but also if you want to comment on this question of the difference it makes that it's rights-based.
Well, you are right, it is a challenge, and in the EU you have at least the objectives, the integrated objectives between employment, social and environmental elements, which are part of the EU treaties. We have the social market economy as the objective. This remains valid even in times of crisis, although in practice we had some difficulties, it's true, to pursue it in a balanced way in all situations, especially when we were confronted with very severe, urgent financial crisis. But the objective is there and it remains. And we have the instruments like the European semester. You can criticize it maybe in governance, but the idea is to have an implementation concrete elements and to discuss this not only at technical level but also at political level. It will be very important for the future post-2015 framework that this discussion on implementation will not only be centered at technical level but also at political level, and that countries present their implementation on the different elements, because it's very difficult to realize the social protection systems without decent work objectives. You have to formalize in a progressive way the informal economy. It's important to have domestic taxation capacities. This requires, of course, also technical cooperation, and we have to assist the countries on this, but it requires, indeed, a comprehensive approach.
Yeah. Thank you very much. So that crucial element, as you say, once the UN summit is over, the risk is the politicians forget about it and all the focus is on the technical. We need to keep it on both. Other thoughts on how, Katie, perhaps, how we actively link it in the agenda to the other goals?
Well, I think one of the issues is also to be realistic about what social protection can do. So we're trying to make the case and to convince the unconvinced. But I think one element of that is also to realize that there is a lot that can happen, but that there are boundaries and that social protection isn't a panacea for all development problems. Many social protection programs, they are targeted at the households and therefore based on assumptions that households can overcome the barriers that they face by themselves. But in fact, as was said, they face many structural barriers as well that social protection in and of itself cannot solve. We need the education, the health sector, economic policies, labor policies to tie into that as well. And so I think that's crucial to keep in mind when we talk about linkages, when we want to convince those that haven't been convinced yet, and try to engage in conversations about how to make those linkages.
But if you like, it is the key challenge here is to make this, if you like, it doesn't really work in English, so I'll use the French expression, a fil rouge. Whatever issue you are looking at, Isabel, whether it be the health, the education, whatever you are doing, that you always have to look at this factor and say, what can it do? How can it contribute? Would you agree? What do you see as the key challenge to link this into the agenda?
Well, I will formulate it in a different way. Look, you don't ask the same to education and say the education has to be linked to transport and to other sectors. You don't ask the same to health. And so why are we asking that of social protection? In a way, it has been because, yes, there are these linkages, but social protection deserves to be considered as a pillar in itself. There are ministries of education, there are ministries of health, and there are ministries of social security and labor. And they deserve the same standing in terms of investment and attention and development attention, and not just be required to be, you know, doing just synergies. So, sorry. No. But look, since you give me the mic, there is a burning issue I want to... Go. You mentioned very rightly so on the austerity cuts. Now, we do need, you know, this happens historically at this time because of the crisis, but we should not let that a short-term policy, you know, these short-term austerity cuts drive a long-term development agenda. You know, these fiscal consolidations, there are programs that governments embark in the short term. They should not drive an agenda that we are thinking for 2030. For 2030, we need to have a clear mind of which are the objectives we want to achieve and work all together in a way that they're ambitious but doable.
And crucial there, but I'll come back to this in a minute, Rudy, that issue of portraying this as an investment in the future, as you said, a benefit for your economy, not as a cost, which is perhaps the way. But I'll get a thought from you on that in a moment, Rudy, but if I could, Magdalena, just on this question of how you see the challenge of linking this to the other goals. Sorry, the mics have all gravitated down that way. So.
I think that it's required a comprehensive approach, and they're all linked, as Isabel said. If we take a very practical example of non-contributory cash transfer programs, what is critical, for example, is to have a gender approach. So oftentimes, states think or try to implement conditional cash transfer that by channeling the cash through the female head of households, they consider that all gender approach are considered. I mean, we're giving money to women. What more gender, exactly, what more gender sensitive that can be. But actually, what we are seeing is that by imposing women the responsibility of complying with conditionalities, for example, you're increasing the time burden of women, and therefore there is a major obstacles for women empowerment, and then they're constrained in joining the labor force, et cetera, et cetera. But you can also see it in another approach. There are also some cash transfer programs that are, again, channeled through female head of household, but on the other hand, all the governance mechanism of the programs are in the hands of men. So we have this stupid result, if you want, that is a program channeled to women, that is the governance body it's managed by male. So this type of things need to be put on the table. There is also a strong link with the healthcare provision, for example. If you provide non-contributory pension to all women, for example, that do not have money, but then you don't deal with the issue of access to healthcare, and they're going to use all the cash that they receive in paying for access to healthcare, there is no point on giving them the cash. So we have to fight back the paradigm that the only role of a state could be in this minimum role of providing minimal safety net. The role of a state has to be broader, and planning, actually, and a comprehensive plan, it's critical.
We'll come back on that. Rudy, a thought, if you would, on this question of how to change the debate. I mean, obviously, this is a room of people who understand the importance of social protection as an investment in the future. Do you think that is more widely perceived? And given this backdrop, as I say, not just Europe, cutting budgets, public spending budgets, but many, many countries in the world. And that point that Isabel just made, you can't do that when you are looking at something with such long-term objectives. How do you think we can address that? Do you think that argument is getting through, or do you see that as one of the major challenges?
Well, I would like to highlight first that for the new Commission, the Juncker Commission, the European Commission, the key priorities are about jobs, it's about growth, it's about fairness, and it's also about democratic renewal. And issues like decent work and social protection are very relevant in this. And about the issue of sustainability of public finance, it is true that in the policy mix, responsible fiscal policy applied wisely, and also structural reforms that include people, I mean, that strengthen the capacities of people are important. So structural reforms is not only about cutting, it is about reforming systems to make them more effective. It's true that sometimes we are confronted with short-term cuts that are necessary, imposed sometimes, and then it's easy, of course, to cut 1 billion in social protection because these are huge budgets. And sometimes it's 25% or more of GDP. But it is important that there is better social analysis of this, and that's also the reason why in the Juncker program, in the issues on future programs that assist countries in difficulties, there is a specific provision that there should be a social analysis of the measures taken. So there is a growing awareness that the social, economic, and financial dimension should go hand in hand.
Sure,
yeah.
Sure. I mean, Isabel, you, as I say, you talked about how this issue has fast-tracked, I think was the word you used, but you also, and you highlighted the example of a country like China that saw the benefits and has done so much in this area. Brazil, there are other countries that are, but there are many others that are at risk of going backwards. How do we address that? And how important, going back to the title of our session, how important is it that social protection is on the post-2015 agenda to address that? Do you see the two things? Rudy, if you could pass your mic, thank you. I'm just going to ask one more question to the panel, then I'm coming out to all of you.
Actually, this is a very good question, but it's a bit more complicated. Actually, most countries are massively expanding the number of social protection programs and the systems themselves. But the fiscal consolidation cuts might lead to short-term reductions on benefits or on the coverage. but the system remains there. So it's a very positive development, no matter the temporary setback that these, austerity cuts might do. In any case, in developing countries, the fiscal consolidation tends not to focus so much on social protection, but mostly on subsidies and wages of civil servants. That is the two main issues used in developing countries. Why it has been mostly higher income economies that have used mostly the reforms of social security.
Okay. Thank you. And Katie, just on this question of a global agenda and a global perspective, we've heard a key characteristic of these goals, more broadly, not just social protection, will be that they are universal. They apply to developed and developing countries. But we've also heard from our opening speakers today the importance that there is no one-size-fits-all, that it needs to be tailor-made. The minister said every country needs to have its own solution. In that context, why is it important, therefore, to have a global perspective on this, and how do you see its relevance in different parts of the world? Because some might say, well, it's a very different issue in different countries, so this is too much of a straitjacket because of the no one-size-fits-all. Can we square that circle? A thought from all of you on that, and then I'm coming out to all of you.
Well, it's certainly true it's not a one-size-fits-all, but I think there are incredible lessons to be learned across, not only between developing countries, but also developed and developing countries. So in New York, people have learned about the CCTs in Latin America. There's a lot of cross-fertilization, if you will, between Brazil and, say, Southern Africa. And so even though it isn't just a copy-paste, there are valuable lessons in these different countries that are crucial to share to bring social protection and its implementation forward, so you don't keep reinventing the wheel. And also to reinforce that positive message about social protection. So that is why I think it is not just a domestic issue or should stay within country.
And you think one can square this circle of a universal approach with tailor-made, with it belonging, the ownership that is so important for each country?
Absolutely. I mean, the right is universal. The right to income security is universal, but the way in which that is done might be different and needs to be tailored to make sure that the universal rights is being reached.
Okay. Magdalena, a thought on that, if you would.
I'm going to go back to the main question. This is a universal agenda, and it is critical that social protection is in. We have to learn the lesson of the MDGs. What it was not included in the MDGs was masked, was invisible. There was no political will to invest at the domestic level. There was no political will to provide the funds from developed countries. So it must be there in this global universal agenda so we can also monitor the implementation and keep track of it.
Thank you. Isabel, thought on this? No? Anything to add?
Well, just to support Magdalena, that's excellent words, yes.
Okay.
Yes, I agree what has been said on these issues. From an EU perspective, I would like maybe to add two elements. It is important that from the EU's perspective, we try to assist countries that want to implement social protection systems and to improve the coverage, that we can mobilize the knowledge that is present in the different ministries of social protection and the institutions and the social partners, that we can mobilize this in partnership with international institutions, and that we can respond to specific needs of partner countries in the world. We have programs on this. We have a program called Socieux. We are stepping up another program called Social Protection Systems. The colleagues dealing with this are in the room. It's my colleagues from DG Development. And it's, I think, very important that those dealing with development policy, the development community, cooperates with the labor employment ministries of the world, and that we cooperate also with those dealing with fiscal and financial policies. We need to sit together and to cooperate. And there are a number of interesting initiatives. This morning you had also already the reference to the so-called Social Protection Interagency Board, which is a complicated name for saying that international institutions, donors, but also other countries cooperate on analytical tools, on governance for social protection, and that this is exchanged. Because otherwise we risk, of course, to end up in a nice text, but no implementation, and we have to invest in the implementation.
Thank you, and we will delve into that, but that really echoes very much what Isabel said in her presentation about when you were addressing the affordability question. Yes, but there are some startup costs that may need to be helped with. Technical assistance, capacity building, absolutely central. And for some ongoing support, but for most, I think you said virtually all, you felt the fiscal space was there. Perhaps we'll come back on that. And perhaps a very crucial question in terms of the image of this issue, when people say, well, we can't afford it. Lovely ideals, marvellous, but how do we afford it? So that affordability argument, one of the central ways to argue for the why. Any questions or indeed comments to what you've heard? I have only one request. I'm seeing lots of hands going up already. Please introduce yourself and please be brief so I can get as many in as possible. Thank you.
Thank you. First of all, thank you for the organizers for this organizing this very interesting conference. I'm Andres Tobias. I work for the Council of Ministers of the EU, and I'm involved in the preparations for the post-2015 agenda and the process. I have a question to Mrs. Ortiz regarding the universality of the social protection. What universality are we talking about in terms of a country? All the citizens which are legally registered in the country, everyone who is there and placed, and if it's the second one, which fits more with the universality concept, is it really affordable? Is it really realistic to offer social protection to everyone in the country? And a second question which is connected, what about illegal migration? When country A, developing country A, is offering full access to social services, aren't we somehow encouraging illegal migration from country B, which does not have the same feature? Thank you.
Thank you very much. I saw, oh, sorry, could you do me a favor? Could you pass it back 2 rows to the lady there? Thank you. I don't know why I'm suddenly...
Alice Coy Martinez. I work for the Flemish Youth Council. As the Belgian minister said earlier today, there are many challenges ahead in guaranteeing social protection in the coming years, not only in Belgium, but also in the surrounding countries. So it's very important that it's taken up in the post-2015 agenda. But isn't there a bit a danger that our countries will say mostly developments need to be made in the less developed countries? Just to give an example, Belgium has support for unemployed people, but it needs to be adequate. Just to make a bit the comparison with the universal human rights, where our countries sometimes tend to focus on other countries.
Thank you. And if you could pass the mic back, we're doing a very efficient system here of moving. And then I'll come round to you, madam. Thank you.
Yes, good morning. My name is Bart Verstraeten. I work for a Belgian NGO, World Solidarity, and we are linked to the Christian labor movement. From a civil society perspective, I was actually just wondering, it's a question for both Ms. Ortiz and Ms. Sepulveda. You have spoken about the Global Fund, and Ms. Sepulveda, together with Professor De Schutter, has launched this idea as well in October 2012. And what relation do you see for civil society in relation to the fund? And I'll explain myself. When it is presented now, it looks like countries can knock at the door of the Global Fund and say, we need funding. Now, if 72% of the population is still excluded today from social protection, there's a lot of civil society organizations out there that organize social protection for those who remain excluded from formal systems nowadays, empower people, organize people, etc. So we also feel when countries come to knock at the door, they would have had a public debate in their countries, ideally with social partners and other interested civil society stakeholders, to come up with a joint plan, because that will guarantee also that there's a broad support base for the policies that are presented to the Global Fund for financing. So, but I'd like to know how you feel about that involvement of civil society.
Thank you very much indeed. Very good question. And we will also, if you could pass that back, please. Thank you. We will also have a panel specifically this afternoon on creating that cooperation, that work with NGOs, with civil society, and how to make it work most effectively. Let's take a couple more. I know I'm overloading you, but in the interest of efficient use of time, one here and then to the back. Please, madam. Thank you.
Cecilie Schildberg from the Friedrich-Ebert Stiftung in Germany. When you were discussing, there came sometimes the word the unconvinced. I would like to know who are exactly the unconvinced. So where should we try to convince or do more work as civil society actors? And the other maybe comment was, isn't if we cut social budget, is it in the long run not more expensive to cut here and not in other budgets, and to think about of the long run negative effects if we don't have coverage?
So the cost of not doing it being a crucial argument as much as the cost of doing it. There was one back here. Sorry, could you wave it? Okay. If you could pass the mic down. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you. Good morning. My name is Tim Rosen. I work for Action for Global Health, which is a European network of NGO advocating for health, the right to health, and in particular universal health coverage, as was presented as one of the 4 guarantees to social protection. I'd like to ask a question, reflection about how to guarantee the rights-based approach within the post-2015 from your perspective. And I'm saying this because we all agree there is no one-size-fits-all, and the global framework cannot dictate everything, and countries will have different responses, as we see different responses even within Europe. But we have a concern that there is nothing currently within global frameworks that would give an incentive to governments to build upon social partners. Currently, certainly from a health perspective, the outcomes, or what is going to be measured, is looking at outcomes, whether it's health outcomes or financial risk protection, whereas it was mentioned certainly at the beginning that there's a need to engage social partners to ensure equity. Okay. So I'd like your reflection on that.
Thank you. And we will hear again in that panel at the end of the day from the social partners themselves. Let's take this group of questions and then I'll try to squeeze in another round. And if I could ask you perhaps the very first question about universality and what does it actually mean? Does it mean everyone? Can you hold that one for a moment? Because I'd like to get a thought from all of you on that. The others were more diverse questions. Just pick up on in the others what is most relevant to you, and then we'll come back to the universality question and what does it mean. Who would like to go first? Magdalena? Yeah, please pick up on what is most relevant to you rather than feeling you all have to answer all the questions.
I'm going to address the issue of the Global Fund and the role of civil society on that. I think that, of course, in any Global Fund and in the various proposals that have been put forward, the role of civil society is critical. First, we're talking about a fund that will ensure the state ownership. And when we set the state ownership, we're not saying that then the government, the current government at that moment, will decide whatever social protection system or program they would like. What it has to be, and that is linked to the other question, it has to be incentive. So a state will put in place meaningful and effective participatory mechanism, inclusive national dialogues in which the priorities of the countries are going to be set, in which civil society participation is going to play a critical role. Another way in which it should participate, this fund should have a governance structure. And again, in any governance structure of any of the proposal of the fund, it should be representative of civil society. We cannot go in establishing a fund, or whatever you want to call it, without the views of civil society participation. And on the other side, and also to be very brief, I also expect that civil society in a broad sense will also contribute to such a fund. Private individuals, these rich private individuals and foundations should also contribute to a fund that will move ahead on social protection.
Thank you very much. Katie.
I wanted to pick up on the point that was made about who is still unconvinced. Well, unfortunately, I think there are still quite a number of people who need to be convinced. Despite the strong arguments that it's affordable, I think many ministries of finance are still very hesitant. And in fact, I think your point about can we afford not to do it is a good way of turning it around. The question is maybe not, is it important to invest, but rather, can we afford not to? But I would also like to say that it might not be that we need to convince everybody of social protection as a whole, but maybe of certain elements of it. So in many countries, we do see quite some enthusiasm about the elements of social protection that can promote people out of poverty or graduate people out of poverty. But focusing on the most marginalized and the poorest, people that may always need support, like elderly or young children, is less popular because it's seen as an unsustainable handout. And I think there the unconvinced are also includes the public. They're widely held perceptions about people becoming lazy or being lazy or using the money irresponsibly. And these, I think, they're very unfounded perceptions, but very pervasive. And I think we also need quite a lot of work in counteracting those.
So just to be clear, and linking this to the universality question, what does it mean? Does it mean everyone? You're not saying it shouldn't mean everyone, but you're saying in communication terms, maybe you need to reframe the debate? Is that what you're saying?
I think the system should include everyone, but how it does depends on your position in life and the way in which you're able to sustain yourself. But we definitely need to bring the message across that people who are in poverty and vulnerable situations and need social protection aren't necessarily lazy or in that position due to their own faults.
Thank you. Isabel, and now we've brought in this universality question, and what really, concretely, we're all agreeing how important this is, but what shape, what form do these systems take in the future, and what is our level of ambition is the key question, and where the consensus, is not always as clear. What for you is the key? And also picking up on the other points, if you would. Thank you.
I'm going to do that, and also link to the gentleman that mentioned on migrants, if they should be included or not. It's a very good question. Look, I think the critical thing is to think of universal systems that are for all. How societies will not do that overnight, very clearly. But this will be a progressive realization on how to do it, and the key thing is somehow to be ambitious also, because otherwise you will spend 800 years before you do anything. But this is being cynical, and this is not true. The reality is, if you look at the history of social security in the last 100 years, and we have a series of maps in the World Social Protection Report that are worth to see. Every decade, there's more and more countries adding new schemes. So what happens is that you see that the systems keep consolidating in more and more countries. At the end of the 19th century is very little, and by the end of the 20th century, there is a lot. So it means that, at one point they introduced schemes for persons with disabilities. At one point, countries, put a scheme for, to support maternity, etc. So you do have a progression. And here the critical thing is to have the system. You might not have the coverage overnight, but if you do the rules of the game and have the system, it allows that then you expand the coverage. Now, the other sectors did the same. As we were mentioning, education, not everybody was educated. I mean, ideas of public education come from the 18th and 19th century, but it took a time that they entered in development. And let me remind you that in the 1980s, it was not about universal education. It was about targeted education, only to support the most poor and vulnerable. Now this went off. At the time of the Millennium Development Goals, everybody says primary education, it must be universal for all children. So somehow it's the same with social protection. You see, the 1980s were kind of a setback in many ways for social development issues, and they have all re-entered. Now we talk about universal health. Now we talk about universal education. So it is time, really, for universal social protection. The shape, as mentioned, each country will have its own speed and its own, approach. But the key thing is to have the systems that are inclusive for all.
Thank you very much. Rudy, thought on that, if you would.
Well, the Commission position on social protection is universal access. It's a universal system. In terms of global outreach, of course, every country has then to define itself how it will implement this, but the objective should be universal, meaning a life cycle approach, so covering the different risks in the life cycle. And of course, also you have to calculate, and therefore you have even in the ILO a department dealing with that, the actual calculations of income and also of expenditure. It's very important in social security. And so this should be an element of the governance of social protection. But the basic principle is universalism and a life cycle approach. And social protection should not only be about income and guarantees, but also about enabling services. You have education, access to health, but also skills development, employment services, and so on. So it should enable people, empower people also.
Thank you. Could I also ask you and Isabel to pick up on this point about the role of civil society? As I say, we will be coming back to it later on, but how do you, that was a specific question, Isabel, in relation to the Global Fund, but more broadly, how you see their role?
We fully welcome it, fully. Well, it is in the Global Fund proposals. Virtually all the Global Fund proposals that have been done, actually, they're open to social society. There are a number of proposals at the moment. And let me tell you that we work closely with the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors, and civil society certainly is very, useful to support implementation, design and implementation of systems. So,
thank you. Rudy, did you want to add anything before I go back out to the audience on this question? No. Okay, let us see. I want to try and identify, we're going to talk in more detail. Here we are, if you like, making that business case for social protection then, but also identify some of the challenges, and then we will delve into that this afternoon. So we'll come back on where we go from here in a moment. But other questions or comments? Does anybody want to join in? Thank you very much. I see one there and I see one right over the other side. I will get to you in a moment. But please, sir, if you could kick us off. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Bart Kriel from the Institute of Tropical Medicine here in Antwerp. So my background is the health sector, and you referred briefly to the issue of universal health coverage, which is indeed interesting with a number of interesting developments. Nevertheless, for the people on the ground, it's sometimes a bit confusing, because if only in the case of the health sector you have some health problems for which people do not have to pay fees, and others they have to pay, and some population groups are exempted from payments and others not. It's all very confusing. It's even more confusing if we consider, as I think we all agree, that people have a lot of priorities, and next to the health sector, there's the education sector, and there's agriculture, and there's housing, and there's employment. All this is at the grassroots level, is extremely fragmented and confusing to people. So I think if we want, this discussion is very important at the global level and eventually in building national frameworks, but at the front line, there is need for much more information to people that is provided in an integrated way and not in sectors.
Thank you.
So what would be your opinion on that?
Thank you. Very much echoing also something Ambassador Frankine said in her opening remarks about a concern that there were now so many goals that it was becoming difficult to communicate. I am coming to you. I'm just going to take a couple more here in the interest of efficiency, and then I'm coming over to you. Please, madam.
Sonia Keppens from the Belgian Development Corporation. I think you don't need only a fund, but what you need is a common programming in the field. I think that is really a big problem. If everybody comes with its own system and its own priorities, then you have problems.
Okay, thank you very much. Short, succinct, and to the point. There was one here, sir. Thank you. And then, madam, I promise I'm coming over to you. Thank you.
Good morning. My name is David Verstokt from the NGO FOS. We are part of the socialist labor movement. I just want to make a little comment, because I have a little problem with this very scientific, difficult language we use when we are talking about social protection, because I think we also have to talk about framing, how we are sending the message. Because also in Belgium there is a debate that every person who gets some kind of social transfer is lazy, doesn't want to look for work. So also if you look at the SDGs, there's nothing about redistribution. The word redistribution, you can't find it in any text, in any indicator, in any target. So if I'm just wondering, we also have to think about framing and doing really an understandable campaign about social protection. I think there's a great need for that.
So that crucial issue of the communication of this and how you protect. I tell you, no, that's not going to be the easiest way. The easiest way is going to be for me to move a little bit faster, and I will get round to you. But that crucial question then, you convince the unconvinced, but you need to reframe the debate more broadly if that is going to happen. Here we are. If somebody could pass the mic down, please, and then I'll come back to the panel after this one.
Thank you very much. Good morning. Rosanna Martinelli, a doctoral student from the University of Antwerp. I hear a lot of discussion about the definition and the scope of social protection. And in one sense, it's been discussed that it should be in its own domain and targeting or not coordinating or not necessarily coordinating like we don't demand other sectors to do. But at the same time, the implementation of social protection schemes in most of the countries have diverse responsibilities. So I wonder if the institutionality that is in charge of implementing the social protection schemes is limited, and there's a need to redefine or without assuring the role of the state, redefining this implementation and following up on the first gentleman's intervention, the integral aspect and the comprehensive aspect of a social protection strategy, which main goal is to eradicate extreme poverty, but at the same time deal with all the middle class or all the quintiles. So it seems a little bit over-encompassing, and at the same time, the implementation seems to be inconsistent with that discourse. And lastly, how can we talk about a human rights approach and universal implementation when at the same time in the Millennium Development Goals and post-agenda we are discussing targets which could limit or put a percentage of advancement and not just a universal aspiration, like in terms of eradicating poverty. And in the same definition, when we talk about social protection floors, aren't we also risking of establishing ceilings, social protection ceilings, instead of floors?
Thank you very much indeed. And we will come back on that crucial question of the implementation. We have another expert panel later, but that's very interesting. If you establish a floor, does it also become de facto a ceiling? Who would like to come in first? Sorry, Tom. Who would like to pick up? Isabel, do you want to pick up, and as I say, pick up on what you think is most relevant for you rather than feeling you have to address all the points?
Okay, there have been a number of very interesting comments. One on the need of better communication, which I fully agree, and this is actually why we are doing this here today. So, but help us, please help us. We are putting lots of materials in ILO website. Go there. There are videos. You have big personalities from Desmond Tutu to you name it, videos of how it's happening in countries, evidence, papers, briefs, all type of forms and shapes. Please help us to disseminate. And of course, we welcome any other initiative, as we were commenting that the Global Coalition for Social Protection Floors is doing great stuff. We do, hold actually the international meetings with governments, and ILO's work plan is approved by all governments of the world, all unions and all employers. So it's not that it does not have support, but the visibility can be better. I fully agree. But I wanted to go to the issue of saying that there are still arguments, on the cost of social protection, and that, look, it is unfortunate that this debate on the MDGs comes at a time of fiscal austerity in Europe, and it has put a number of very strong arguments, against the welfare state and all that. I want you to bring your attention back to the global distribution of income. If you recall that slide, the top 20% of the world holds more than between 60 and 70% of world income. And the rest hold very little, okay? So you might hear detractors talk and give many arguments, but please keep in mind that slide, because, see, underdeveloping or cutting cost is actually benefits the ones on the top, really. And the arguments for having systems that, permeate more and bring benefits down to society are very, very strong from any point of view, from an investment point of view, as well as from a human rights point of view.
Thank you. Who would like to come in next? Magdalena and then Katie.
I will respond to the issue of targeting. I think that this is a critical point. And when poverty and deprivation is widespread, there is no point in targeting. Targeting will not achieve sustainable reduction in poverty. It will fail to bring in the middle classes that are necessary for funding and also for ensuring quality public services. And it will also put a threat to social cohesion, and that put a risk on political stability. So it is critical. When we talk about issues of social protection, countries should move progressively to universal achievement, and we have to move away from very restricted targeting mechanism. And very briefly on the issue of fragmentation, I think that that is indeed a very practical implementation obstacles for social protection. We see that within countries, sometimes social protection programs are implemented without any strategy, without a social protection system, therefore without a multi-sectorial approach, therefore it is ineffective. And on the other hand, we also see that donors, being development agencies or big development NGOs, are coming with their own programs instead of working together, creating very insignificant pilot projects that will not make a change.
So for you, I was going to ask, and perhaps as we're moving towards the end, for you the key challenge would be the systematic approach. That is the central, as you said earlier, once you've got that and once you've got the right systems, then you can gradually expand. Is that, as you see it, the central challenge as we now look to not only integrate this into the agenda, but then later on to implement it?
I think that is critical, and it's also linked to the fact that social protection mechanisms are not a silver bullet. They have to be part of a much more comprehensive approach, and as I said before, a systemic approach with coherency in different policies is critical for implementation.
Thank you. Katie, you wanted to come in and also on this question of how you see the challenge ahead, if you would, as we're running out of time.
All right, well, first picking up on that issue of fragmentation as well, and the question that was asked about the grassroots level, because I think the fragmentation is a problem at the higher level, but certainly also in the communities doing much of the work. And I think that will be a challenge moving forward, as many countries are trying to scale up their programs. They're trying to look at the capacity that's available to actually implement these programs, and a lot of that comes down to the capacity available at communities where you have particular committees or health workers, social workers. They're very good at doing their job, but they're being stretched. So I think one of the key challenges is also to build the capacity both at the top as well as at the grassroots level. But another challenge, I think, links to the communication, as well as that question about affordability. Because, yes, we need to communicate what social protection is in easier language, what it can do, but I think we also need to then walk the talk, as they say. So we can say that we need to extend social protection to everyone, that it's universal, but the way in which we do it and the rhetoric that goes with it is very important as well. So an example from close to home, in the UK, we have 300 staff in revenue looking at whether people pay their taxes correctly, particularly at the higher end. 300. That's in comparison to 3,000 staff who look at whether there's any benefit fraud or not. So that just gives you a sense of, how universal is it really, and how much do we think it is a right of people to have social protection?
Thank you. Isabel and Rudy, a thought on the key challenges ahead, how you see them. I think, have you still got a mic down there, or is it migrated? Yes, whoever, either first. You go first, Rudy. How do you see the challenge ahead?
Well, also related to communication, I mean, the challenges are still important. I mean, quite frankly, if you see that in the global garment supply chain, the majority of workers have no injury insurance. So you had the accident at Rana Plaza, the workers had no insurance, so they have no income. You have still even industrialized countries where you have a very short maternity protection, a few weeks, but unpaid. Is this normal? I mean, how can you function in such a kind of society, especially when working conditions are very difficult? And in many countries still, even in the EU, you have a high percentage of out-of-the-pocket payments for healthcare, which can ruin a family. I mean, so the challenges are there. Both in the north and in the south, but there is a will to address this. And as said by Isabel, I mean, we should not underestimate the fact that social protection, decent work, but also issues like inclusive growth and taxation are part of the MDG. I do not agree that redistribution is not part of post-2015 because taxation is addressed several times. And social protection is even put in one of the targets together with taxation. So there is still a lot to do, certainly. On some elements related to future action, it is, I think, important that we have integrated approaches. You can say this is maybe very academic, but also at local level, when you are active locally, you will see that you have competing priorities. I mean, in a local council in a city, you have many, many priorities, and you have to choose. And until now, issues like decent work and social protection have not been key priorities in many countries when it comes to, for instance, development assistance.
So picking up on that point, and by way of a conclusion to our session, we have many, many priorities. I will accept this question is slightly unfair. I know there is no magic bullet, and that this is a very multi-dimensional issue, and there are many challenges to address. But if we are to walk the talk, as Katie just put it, for each of you, and I'll start with Rudy and just come down the line, what would be, of the many priorities, your one priority to ensure that social protection takes its rightful place, as you have identified it, in the post-2015 agenda, and that we really make progress, that we implement and, as Tom put it earlier, use it to remedy the unacceptable situations that exist? What for each of you is your one priority? And you have about 30 seconds each. Rudy first, your one priority of all the things we've discussed. It's not fair, I know.
Let's say that social protection, following the September adoption of the post-2015 framework, social protection should be on the agenda of every country. There should be a definition of priorities and a timeline for implementation. And they should also identify how it can be implemented in practice, and mobilizing the local communities, the social partners, the government's capacity, but also ICT. I think that new informatics and ICT can play an important role in this. So start working at national level, and the international community, and the EU including, has to develop assistance facilities.
Thank you very much. Come back to all those issues this afternoon. Isabel.
I want to see it as an opportunity we have here to, in this final round of the Sustainable Development Goals and Financing for Development, ensuring that social protection for all, including social protection floors, is in the SDGs, and that there is a financing mechanism for social protection in the Addis Ababa Accord, and also that there is an agreement that national procurement is in accordance with labor legislation and social security contributions.
Thank you very much. Katie.
I would say that social protection needs a legal framework, and these programs need accountability mechanisms in each country so that the citizens can hold their governments to account if they are excluded or if the programs don't do what they promise to do. So there's a lot of promises in the SDGs and in global frameworks, but it really needs to be legalized and have that accountability there.
Thank you very much. Magdalena, you have the last word.
Easy for me. I will say all of the above, plus coherence in the implementation at the domestic and international level.
Thank you. And how to achieve that coherence we will discuss in the later panels. But first, ladies and gentlemen, will you join me in thanking our panel very much indeed. Thank you to all of you so much.